Is Libya the answer to the refugee crisis in Europe? The Hungarian Prime Minister proposes building a city for refugees on the Libyan coast. Could the plan work? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Poison. That's how Hungary's Prime Minister has described the arrival of refugees in Europe. So far, the 28 EU countries have failed to agree on how to deal with hundreds of thousands of refugees trying to get to northern Europe. Mr. Orban has particularly attacked the open door policy of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, but he is vehemently opposed to the EU's mandatory quota system for countries to take a share of refugees. And now he has a new idea, and Libya is key.
Let's make an effort that those who arrived illegally should be taken out. But in order to take them out of the EU, we must designate a place to put them into and where they can wait for the legal process. This more or less can only be on the coast of Libya. This is why Libya becomes a key country. This is why Libya must be unified. This is why I think the arms embargo should be lifted and terminated for Libya. The appropriate Libyan forces must be armed so they can set up a stable government.
Well, Hungary has refused to take part in any of the refugee schemes as part of the relocation plan. It's built a fence on its southern border and is planning to build another one next to the existing one. Now, these were the scenes last September when Hungarian police clashed with people who were trying to cross the border and get into Serbia. Well, Libya is an increasingly popular departure point for migrants who are hoping to get to Europe. Now their main route through the Balkans has been closed. 1 million people have used that route, making the dangerous journey starting in Syria by boat to Turkey before heading to Greece, then travelling through the Balkans towards northern Europe. But when the Balkan countries closed their borders to curb the flow of refugees, the route changed, with many now setting off from Libya. And that's where the Hungarian Prime Minister wants a camp built. Many of the refugees who begin their journey in Libya come from other parts of Africa, from Nigeria, Eritrea, Guinea, Ivory Coast and Somalia. Let's bring in our panel now. We have Adam Labor, who's the Hungary correspondent at The Economist and joins us from the capital, Budapest. From London, George JOFFE, Deputy Director of the Global Policy Institute at Cambridge University. And from Durham in the UK, THOM Brooks, Head of the Law Department at Durham University. Can I start with you, Adam, and give us some context as to what has brought about these remarks from the Hungarian Prime Minister? It was on the fringes of a meeting of Balkan leaders.
Well, it's got a long-term context and a short-term context. The short-term context is that a week today, on Sunday, Hungarians are going to vote in a referendum on the EU's plan for compulsory quotas for refugees, under which Hungary would receive about 1,300. And the government has gone all out to get the necessary no vote on this. And the whole country is plastered with billboards warning of the dangers of migrants, warning of the dangers of immigration, and it's become a very hot button political issue here. So all the things that Mr. Orban does, first of all, we have to think about them in terms of domestic context. But of course, the long-term issue is the country was profoundly shocked last summer when thousands of people were pouring through the borders every day with no controls, just coming up through Europe, coming up from Greece, Macedonia, Serbia, and across the border into Hungary, then moving on. And the main railway station here, the Keleti train station, was turned into a giant open-air refugee camps. And these scenes were quite shocking and for many Hungarians. And as such, they've left a real legacy of nervousness and fear about migration because it was so badly handled last summer.
All right, George, but the proposal is a giant refugee camp to be built on the coast of Libya. Is this a proposal that's likely to be taken seriously? And is this something that Libya could even contemplate at this particular time in its history?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that this is not the first time this has been proposed. It was proposed 10 years ago by Mr. Berlusconi, then Italian Prime Minister, and he tried to set up a series of reception camps in Libya. He was eventually prevented from doing so by the disapproval of the European Union and the United Nations. Secondly, Libya at the moment is in a state of virtual civil war, and removing the arms embargo is not going to resolve that. So it's very difficult to see how there can be any central authority in Libya that could construct the city that Mr. Orban proposes. And thirdly, Libya is not able to sustain it. The country depends for 90% of its food to be imported. It's at the moment in a state of real crisis over domestic security. There's just no way in which that could be done. And finally, migrants on the coast will still look towards Europe and still try to get here.
Tom Brooks in Durham. I'm just wondering about the fact that Balkan leaders have peeled themselves away from the rest of their EU colleagues and met separately and not agreeing to anything in particular from what I can tell, but clearly not adding to the European Union's quest to formulating some sort of coherent policy to deal with the refugee crisis.
That's absolutely right. There's been a real divided opinion in Europe on what to do next. You had some, like Germany, that were more opening their arms to some degree. You had others like David Cameron in Britain, who was a bit more cold on the idea of opening Europe's doors to migrants. There's a real division of opinion across the continent, and this has played out in a variety of ways, namely a lack of leadership on what to do that has made the situation for everyone much worse. I'm not too surprised to hear about this meeting by the Balkan leaders. In part, they're on the front line to some degree, alongside Greece and Italy and some other countries that have taken more of the brunt of migration that has come into Europe. Remember, the way that migration is handled in Europe is that if someone were to come in and claim asylum, the EU rules are that that person ought to have their claim processed in the first country they set foot in. And so these countries on the border are the ones that have to do the processing. They're the ones who have the costs. These are the ones who have the burdens. They are the ones with the responsibility. And I think that it's unsurprising to hear that for many of them, some kind of change is needed. Maybe a year ago, if the quota system was used and used effectively, some of this might have been avoided. But a year or more later in the migration crisis, I think you see people to some degree unwilling to compromise on this issue.
All right, Adam, tell us a bit more about Hungary, because Hungary throughout this crisis has stood out as being perhaps the most vociferous against the possibility of accepting foreigners, refugees or migrants. What is Hungary like?
Well, Hungary is a country of 10 million people in the centre of Europe. Borders Ukraine on one side and Slovenia and Austria on the other. But it's a country like its neighbours, Hungary, the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Poland, the countries in the area, which has no experience of mass immigration. It's monocultural, it's overwhelmingly white, it's overwhelmingly Christian. There's a gypsy community here, there's a reasonable sized Jewish community here, but it's very similar in its culture and in its approach, and it's a much more conservative country than Western Europe. Also, again, because what we're seeing here in Hungary is the spearhead of this, but there's a movement happening across the region. There's the re-emergence of Central Europe, led by Hungary and Poland. They're very conservative socially countries. All the things, what we have to remember when we're talking about the former countries that were in the communist bloc, well, all the things that happened in the West, like the 1968 student uprisings, the rise of feminism, the rise of gay rights, the rise of the idea of multiculturalism, none of that happened here. All these countries were frozen off for more than 40 years, were sealed off and frozen socially. So now you see all these contradictions and these stresses and strains that they're in the EU and they're expected to adopt what we might call the Western liberal multicultural agenda, but they don't want to. And now they sense very clearly with Brexit, the EU is weakened, And it's no coincidence at all that this is happening after Brexit. They know that the central control of Brussels is much less strong than it used to be. Now is their chance to forge ahead with their own social agenda, which is completely different from that of David Cameron and Angela Merkel.
OK. And George, by highlighting Libya as being key or central to this proposed idea of stemming migration into this part of Europe, who are the main targets? I'm thinking of sub-Saharan Africans particularly, of course, migration that has gone on for generations, hasn't it?
Well, that's certainly true. And the main target will be from Central Africa and from West Africa. Migrants in the Middle East are relatively few in the context of Libya, and they have been coming for a very long time. Colonel Gaddafi, when he was in charge, used the migrant issue as a means of extracting from Europe, extorting in fact, advantages. And so it's not surprising that that's now become the main route. But it's also the insecurity there and the fact that the militias that run Libya are out of control and have become part of a criminal network that makes the issue now so acute. And it's really acute for Italy. Italy's been the main target of the migrant flows that have actually come. But again, one has to understand that the idea of parking migrants inside Libya in the conditions that exist there, particularly given the lack of supplies, the lack of energy, surprisingly for an oil-rich state, and the lack of control and security, would be an absolute disaster. In September 2000, for example, in Libya, because of migration, there were major riots that involved hundreds of deaths throughout Libya, particularly in the coastal areas that Mr. Orban thinks he can park the migrants in. It's just not a viable possibility. And the fact is that it represents a failure of European migration policy going back over decades. What Europe tried to do was to make sure that the countries around it, its so-called ring of friends, would act as the people who would control migration on its behalf. Now that's simply broken down since 2011. And you can't expect countries like Libya with a population of 6 million people to be able to act as, say, Turkey has done with a population of 70 or 80 million people in absorbing major migrant flows. It's just not going to happen.
That takes me on to my next point. And Tom, I was going to ask you about the deal made between the European Union and Turkey, because that's often mentioned as the model that they would like to replicate with other countries. But is that deal working?
There's been a lot of strain with that deal. And I think that to some degree, it has been a success in slowing down some of the numbers. There has been some cooperation, but to another degree, it is not, because I think that the bargain with Turkey was not only that Turkey was going to help Europe with Europe's problems, so to speak, but also that there was going to be something in return for Turkey for acting on Europe's behalf and helping it with the migration crisis. And much of that has been coming too slowly, if at all. So I think that there's been real strain with that. And of course, Turkey has had, it hasn't been without cost. It has a border with Syria. It's dealing with problems and concerns of its own in its immediate backyard. The Europe's concerns with migration are, of course, are of importance to it, but it's not the only thing affecting it. And I think that it's been too little, too late, in large degree, for Turkey. But of course, it's also the case that when the deal was struck, however successful it was going to be, it was only going to be a sticking plaster. It wasn't going to solve any problem. It wasn't going to end any problem. A lot of people thought it was just going to push migration flows to more dangerous and newer points. And that's exactly what you're seeing right now. People making the journey coming from other places, perhaps more dangerous areas, making more perilous journeys into Europe, and causing this problem that Europe tried to solve with the Turkey deal. If anything, it's made the problem perhaps a bit worse in ways it should have foreseen.
And George, coming back to Libya then, there is the prospect, shall we say, of a sweetheart deal with Europe. The Turks have demanded, and as we understand, receiving billions in terms of financial assistance, not to mention other sweeteners to this deal. Isn't this something that perhaps the Government of National Accord, the latest incarnation of government in Libya. Isn't that something that perhaps they could rally to?
Well, the problem is manifold. First of all, Libyans generally do not want foreign interference inside their own country, even in their current parlous state. They've made that very clear. Secondly, the government of national accord is about to collapse. It's been outwitted, outsmarted and outgunned by the forces of the East. Thirdly, Libya is very close to bankruptcy, and therefore it's not got the institutions that could absorb funds from Europe. And there's no way in which Europe is going to provide the funding that would be necessary. You need to remember that the majority of the migrants coming in through Libya are economic migrants. They're not refugees. And they're still going to want to come. And if you can't offer them employment, useful employment in Libya, and they can't have it at home, they're still bound to flow northwards. And the problem is that Europe, for many, many years, never really attended to this crisis, thinking it could simply exclude it. And now it's discovered it really can't.
And going to Adam now in Budapest. So it seems very much as though Mr. Orban is playing to his domestic audience when he suggests that this giant holding camp be built in Libya. But he is facing quite a bit of criticism, isn't he, with regard to the whole issue of refugees and migrants. Human Rights Watch, I know, have documented what they say is Hungary's breach of its legal obligations under European and international law. There's also been a call, I think, by Luxembourg for Hungary to be expelled from the European Union. Is this something that might stay Mr. Orban's hand?
No, I don't think so. I think that nobody really took much notice of the call from Luxembourg. It wasn't from a very senior or well-known politician, and nobody gets expelled from the European Union. It's never happened, and the process really would result in such kind of domestic and diplomatic chaos afterwards that's really not on the agenda. And such calls are a bit silly, really, because they do take away the heat from real questions about how Hungary has altered the asylum system here. As you say, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, the Helsinki Committee here, a number of NGOs have very serious concerns about the way the asylum system has been re-engineered over the last year, the way that people are pushed back. There's now an 8-kilometre exclusion zone inside Hungary, how that's monitored. If any refugees or migrants are found within 8 kilometres, then they're pushed back over the border physically. There's an all number of concerns about this, but nonetheless, there's really no international means of sanctioning Hungary for this. And Hungary says that the Hungarian government says we were elected in a free and fair election, and we're a democracy, and these are the policies we wish to pursue. And it's really not much of your business what we do, because this is our sovereign territory. So it's, in a way, it's similar to other international crises. There's no international police mechanism to deal with countries that seem to be breaching norms.
But I'm wondering about the nature of the debate, staying with you, Adam, the nature of debate within Hungary, because it wasn't that long ago that Hungary itself was in need of, or so many Hungarians were in need of refuge, of sanctuary, and 180, 200,000 of them had to flee from Hungary, and they had to find places of safety in other parts of Europe and well beyond that. So is there a distinct memory of that?
Yes, and some people have pointed that out. I've said that myself to MPs from the ruling Fidesz party. Look, as you say, 50 years ago, in 1956, Hungary produced up to 200,000 refugees who were given sanctuary and given the chance to make a new life. So don't you think that Hungary is a country that's produced so many migrants and whose people have found such a welcome around the world could be a bit more generous in taking in migrants? And they say, well, no, because it's not the same thing. They say that genuine refugees cases from places like Syria will be considered fairly, and they'll be given the chance to claim for asylum. But a lot of the people that are coming through are economic migrants, as you noted yourselves. As George noted, especially in Libya, the people are coming up from Central and Sub-Saharan Africa, which are not really war zones. And so they're saying that we have to distinguish between genuine refugees, as we were, and also people who are economic migrants. And they're very open as well about the cultural differences. The Hungarian officials say, look, many of these people are Muslims. We don't want a substantial Muslim community in Hungary.
All right, Tom, that brings us, doesn't it, to the established conventional definitions of migrant or refugee. So we're talking particularly today about the streams of people that have been coming for decades, if not longer, from sub-Saharan Africa up to the Mediterranean coast of Africa, trying to get into Europe. But many of those may not come from conflict zones per se, but people from Gambia, for instance. I mean, are they classified as economic migrants, or are they classified as refugees? We know of the oppressive nature of government in Gambia, for instance.
Sure. I think that the way it works is the fact that someone comes from a country doesn't mean that therefore that they are an accepted for asylum or not. Everything is taken on an individual basis, and there's an accepted definition about it. I think the main issue here is that 100 years ago, you didn't have these kinds of flows. You didn't quite have this level of migration coming across to Europe from outside. And also in our modern technological world of passports and papers and so on, you have people coming across who may not have ID, may not have a passport, may have a forged passport, and it can take time to investigate whether or not their claims for any abuses or risk of unlawful detention and other things that might afflict them at home to see whether any of these things are true. Typically in the UK, it might take easily 6 months for a claim to be heard. Many can take a year. There are costs associated with this, not least to the people who make the claims for asylum, and then the problems of trying to rebuild their lives, whether or not they are successful in those appeals. So it's done on an individual basis, and that raises its own level of difficulty. It wasn't always done that way, but it is. Since the Second World War, this has been the model that we've had now. There's a lot of calls to try to change it, people making this distinction between economic migrants and of course, I'm an economic migrant, so we do exist, and sometimes we're even on television. But this distinction between economic and refugee migrants. But I think that it's one thing to make that distinction. It's another thing in order to enforce it in practice. And I think that that is going to be one of the more difficult challenges moving forward as Europe tries to grapple with this, with the scale of this issue.
And Adam, I'm not sure that the definition of refugee or economic migrant would make much difference in Budapest. As you've pointed out, Hungarians go to the polls in a referendum. What specifically will they be voting on? What is the question in front of them?
The question is whether they want the European Union to be able to relocate non-Hungarian citizens to Hungary without Parliament's consent. And what that's generally seen to be in reference to is the decision in 2016 in September by the European Council, the European leaders, to have something called an emergency response mechanism, which would set up a quota system under which Hungary, for example, would receive 1,294 people.
Which doesn't sound like a huge number, but how are Hungarians likely to vote?
Well, they'll vote, it seems, according to the opinion polls, if we believe them, they'll vote overwhelmingly in favour of what the government wants, and they'll say no to that question. The question is, domestically, more is what will the turnout be? If the turnout, in order for the referendum to be valid, it has to be 50% turnout of eligible voters. And so if there isn't a high turnout, then the opposition will be able to say, oh, look, the referendum failed, the government got the no vote, but not enough people bothered to come and vote. And, referendums, as we've seen in Britain with Brexit, can be quite unpredictable things. You can never quite know what's going to happen. But I would say certainly the government will get the vote that it wants, but it's not clear that it's going to get the turnout that it wants. Nonetheless, the opposition here is so hopeless and divided and fractious that it wouldn't really matter that much, even if they didn't get the turnout that they wanted and the referendum was invalid, because there's really no serious opposition beyond NGOs and a couple of smaller liberal parties to this proposal.
Gentlemen, I must thank you all for taking part in our conversation today on Inside Story. Adam Labor, George JOFFE and Tom Brooks, thank you all. And as ever, thank you for watching. You can see the programme again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com. If you want more discussion, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. But from me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.